Hello and welcome to my channel. The subject of this video is Villains of the Vedas Part 2, the DASYUS. Introduction. The subject of the DASYUS is a nexus for many of the most controversial subjects of the Vedas. Within this Gordian knot are the threads of universalist versus exclusivist debates, ethnic, historical, and ethical controversies which echo until this day. For this reason, it is an important subject which we should take care with, yet, at the same time, not retreat from objectively examining the questions and issues involved because of secondary considerations. In the first part of this study, we will briefly examine and critique the two dominant theories regarding the DASYUS and categorize the verses in which they appear in the Vedas. In part 2, I will present my own speculation on who these enemies of the seers may have been. As I am something like Esau, that my hand is against every man intellectually, some of my views may not make everyone happy. I wish to add at this point, as always, that I'm sharing my research as it stands at the moment. I'm not positioning myself as an authority. Also, while I work to be thorough, there is certainly more to add on this subject. I am working predominantly with the information presented in the text of the Veda Samhitas and not, for example, with the archaeological research on a wide scale. I will post as many of the sources as possible in the notes below, and I welcome both comment and critique. Part 1. Two dominant theories, savages and symbols. Aryan migration theory, subjugated aborigines. Quote, "It was the period of migrations, of endless, turbulent feuds among small, unsettled tribes with their nobles and priests. People fought for pastures, for cows, and arable lands. It was the period of conflict between the fair-skinned immigrants, who called themselves Arya, and the native, the dark people, the unbelievers, that propitiated not the gods." Unquote. This quote from the 19th century Sanskritist Hermann Oldenberg encapsulates the view of the Aryan invasion into the subcontinent held in his era. In this scheme, the DASYUS were the Aborigines subjected by the Aryan invaders and eventually converted into the lower caste Shudras and outcasts. They were the people called by another Western scholar, Clayton, jungle tribes, which is reminiscent of 1930s Tarzan films. While the modern academy in the West has shied away from the racial component after World War II because of its centrality to German National Socialism, a leitmotif of this theory, which continues to play until today, is that the DASYUS of the Vedas represented those linguistic groups which lived in the subcontinents before the arrival in waves of the Sanskrit-speaking Aryans around roughly 1500 BC. This is not the place to examine the Aryan invasion theory in depth. I have done that from the vantage point of the Rig Veda elsewhere. I will discuss here only one point and one counterpoint. The strongest argument against the Aryan migration theory based upon the text of the Rig Veda itself is that it is completely absent from the collective memory of the 5 tribes. One does not find in the Rig Veda injunctions from Lord Indra which echo Jehovah's mandates to his people to wrest the land from the Canaanites, nor is there any narrative describing how of the ancestors of the Aryan tribes came to the land of the seven rivers. Within the cultural memory represented by the seers of the Vedic era, the tribes had always been there. Counterpoint: the Aryan migration into the European continent. One argument against the thesis that the five tribes were possibly autochthonic is that there is no memory of the Aryan migration into Europe, and yet the largest body of opinion is that our own European ancestors did move into the continent in waves in the ancient world. Thus, it is asserted, absence of folk memory of the event does not argue against its occurrence. However, this is problematic. First, we do not know if there was such a memory in Northern Europe among the Celtic and Germanic zones because their traditions were purely oral. These were wiped out by the Imperial Romans, specifically under Claudius, when he suppressed the Celtic Druids in 54 AD, and later completely by the Roman Church. Second, there are in fact myths which reflect some of the last waves of migrations into Europe. These are found in Greece. The legend of the return of the Heraclids is the migration of the Greeks who spoke the Doric dialect into Hellas. Let's pause a moment to reflect on this point and the ramifications for the Aryan migration theory into the subcontinent. While certainly a disputed topic from a variety of angles, the common date for the Dorian migration is 1200 BC. Greek literature begins with Homer, circa 850 AD, so there are 350 years or 14 generations of 25 years apart. The Aryan invasion is generally given at 1500 BC. The academic date of the Rig Veda is between 1500 to 1200 BC, with all parties agreeing it was composed in the land of the seven rivers, or the location of the invasion/migration itself. Thus, the oldest Veda is contemporary to the event to up to 300 years or 12 generations of 25 years from the events at the very most, with again the oldest part of the Rig Veda, the family books, being closer to the alleged event. How is it that the Greeks could have a memory that at least some Greek speakers came from elsewhere, even in mythic form, yet the seers of the Vedas had none? To compound the case, between the Dorian invasion and the later Greeks lay the chasm of a dark age. Yet, they remember, no such divide separates the seers of the Rig Veda from the actual event. Considering the tightness of their oral tradition, even according to the professors, it's impossible that they would not recall such a central event. There was no migration into the subcontinent, at least based on the text of the Rig Veda. Implications. This leads to an important question which is relevant for this study. If both the Aryan tribes and the amorphous DASYUS are both indigenous to the region, why is there conflict? Does the very conflict itself not imply that one, at least, was an outsider? The simple answer to that is no. Human groups have conflicts for a wide variety of reasons, not only within themselves but with others. especially given the lack of details to establish a chronology of events. The universe of possibilities for the conflict between the Aryan and the DASYUS cannot be limited to just one possibility. Even if one argues that it must, then it is still unclear, for perhaps it was the DASYUS who were the invaders. Thus, there are two potential invasions/migrations inherent in one argument for a migration. Aurobindo, symbols of inner darkness. As the antithesis to the thesis of the Aryan invasion, the 20th century scholar and mystic Aurobindo argued that there were no physical DASYUS at all. To him, they are a symbolic construct of the seers. It is for this reason that the hymns in which they feature cannot be an account of the political and military struggle between Aryan invaders and Dravidian cave dwellers. Regarding the conflict, he goes on to tell us, quote, "It is a struggle between the seekers of light and the powers of darkness. The cows are the illumination of the sun and the dawn. They cannot be physical cows. Therefore, equally, the Panis must be taken as the powers of the cave of darkness." Unquote. He further refines this symbolic reading of the term DASYUS. Quote, "The DASYUS are the haters of the sacred word. They are those who give not to the gods the gift or the holy wine, who keep the wealth of their cows and horses and other treasures for themselves, and do not give that to the seers. They are those who do not sacrifice." Unquote. Further, in another paragraph, quote, "Therefore it is clear these Pani DASYUS are crooked powers of the falsehood and ignorance who set their false knowledge, their false strength, will, and works against the gods and the Aryans. The triumph of the light is the triumph of divine knowledge of the truth against the false or demonic knowledge. The victory is the ascent of the sun, the birth of the days, the advent of the dawns, the release of the herd of shining rays, and their mounting to the world of light." Unquote. Conversely, the Aryans are not a tribe, according to him, at all. His definition of an Aryan is one who pursues the divine light. Quote, "The Aryan is the sacrificer, Yajamana. The gods who receive, uphold, impel his sacrifices are the powers of the sacrifice. The DASYUS is the opposite of both. He is without sacrifice. The Aryan in the sacrifice finds the divine word. He is the Brahmin or the singer of the word. The gods delight in all and uphold the word. The DASYUS are haters and destroyers of the word. They have no force of the divine breath or no mouth to speak it. They have no power to think and materialize the word and the truth it contains." Unquote. To Aurobindo, the subcontinent in the Vedic era was culturally and ethnically homogeneous and in no way distinct from the later world of Hindu epic poetry. His Brahmin ancestors were always exactly the same. The only distinction was between those who follow the Vedic path and those who do not. Along the same lines in medieval Italy, everyone was Catholic. There were only those who were truly Christians within the whole fold of the Holy Mother Church and those who were sinners outside of it. When the sages speak of conflict or battle in the Vedas, it is his contention that these are poetic expressions of an internal, moral and psychic struggle against the darkness of human nature alone. They might also be read as meditative experiences, but never physical violence. After all, the seers were mostly Brahmins, and the law of Manu says a Brahmin must not even strike his own head, much less cause injury to another living being. Critique: the material reality of spoils and not rays of light. I would like to say a brief word about my personal reflections on Aurobindo's methodology of reading the Vedas and its background. He was a nationalist who lived during a period when his country was under occupation by a foreign power. The British Empire ruled India, as she did all her stolen territories, with a strategy of tension designed to create social conflict which the imperial government would manage, as well as economically exploiting both land and people. In exchange, she offered a cultural imperialism in which the subjugated were supposed to learn to identify with their abusers in a sort of Stockholm syndrome, to create the human gears for the local arm of the imperial machine. In addition to all this, Aurobindo also watched as the Western intellectuals began to expropriate the Vedas as if they were just a canyon to be strip mined to serve a variety of ends. In that era, predominantly to support the dominant Hegelianism which served as the rationale for Western imperialism, i.e. the progress of the spirit, before it was replaced by the secularized evolutionary ideas of social Darwinism. Aurobindo's enterprise was one of reclamation on several levels. While justified in itself, the problem is that it becomes predicated upon a nationalist instead of an imperialist ideology, as in the case of the Western academics. Unfortunately, he falls into the same trap as those he is resisting in seeking to make the Vedas conform to a political agenda. The effect of this is distortion. That, anyway, is my view on the matter. To return to the main subject at hand, Aurobindo claims all internal evidence of the Veda, which this image of the panis, the cows, the anjari suckers establishes invariably the same conclusion, unquote. This conclusion is that the cattle presented in the Rig Veda, and by extension the other Vedas, are nothing more than rays of light. The qualifier all is a universal inclusive. This is a very broad claim, since there are a wide variety of references to not only the DASYUS, but to conflicts with them and to cattle, as well as other livestock. It is specious to claim that all are reducible to the symbolic construct he outlines. It is absolutely true that some are. There is certainly an esoteric component to the Vedas, but not all. There are several approaches which could be used to demonstrate that Aurobindo's reading cannot be consistently established across all verses of the Vedas as he claims. Here we will examine just one: specific gifts received by the seers and their own spoils from battle. This will show that at least some of the mantras related to cattle raids against the DASYUS do refer to material historical events. Material spoils of conflicts. In the Rig Veda, there are a number of verses where the sages tell us of either gifts they received from warriors who won battles, no doubt through the help of the powerful Vedic fire rituals, and also detailed personal statements by the Brahmins of their own fruits of combat. Chronologically, these reports are restricted to the earlier phases of Vedic history. By the time of the Atharva Veda, the caste system was already emerging to some degree, and the Brahmins do not seem to have been active in combat any longer. General statements. Before analyzing the personal reports, we will look briefly at some of the general statements which are in dispute at this juncture. Lord Agni, we are told, gives booty from battle, as do the divine twins, the Ashivns. We are told men call on Indra for spoils. This combat is with unbelievers. In both the Rig and the Atharva Veda, we are told explicitly that these are cattle raids. Upon examining clearly historic accounts, it will become clear that these are not descriptions of psychological or astral processes, but material events involving actual cows. Personal statements. Livestock. Quote, "From which generous prince, soliciting my acceptance, I, Chpt, unhesitatingly accepted 100 niskas, 100 vigorous steeds, and 100 bulls. 10 chariots drawn by bay steeds and carrying my wives stood near me, given by Svanya, and 1,060 cows following. 40 bay horses, harnessed by the chariots, the Pajras, the kinsmen of Chpt, rubbed down the high-spirited steeds, decorated with gold trappings. I have accepted a prior grant, kinsman, for you, 380 harnessed chariots and cattle of uncalculable value." Unquote. In these verses, the seer Chpt describes large donations he received from Savanya and shared with his clan. We have not only 2 named individuals, but a fairly detailed list of the gifts, and even references to an event in which the sage's wives, so he was not celibate in the forest like in the Upanishads, rode in a parade displaying the donation publicly. He even tells us how his kinsmen treated some of the horses and their disposition as high-spirited. This is clearly the record of an actual event. It is not unique. In other hymns, we find 1,000 horses as gifts. In the 5th mandala, a sage received a gift of 4,000 head of cattle, and shortly afterwards a report of 10 horses. There is mention of a donation of 100 horses. In another hymn of the same mandala, the sages describe 100 camels and 10,000 cattle. And on the subject of camels, another mantra reports 100 camels and 2,000 cattle. Later, we find references to 1,000 cows and specific numbers of cattle such as 77, and in another verse, 73 cows. Quote, "The affluent Syava, the lord of kine, has given to me upon the banks of the Suvastu a present of 73 cows. Here is found not only a very specific number of cattle given by, again, an identified individual, but even a specific location. Such statements do not lend themselves easily to symbolic reinterpretation when the meaning itself is clear. There are also direct statements by sages that they fought for cattle in raids, and they give specific numbers as to the numbers of cows won. The Seer Pajra, and later the sage and Brahmin Mudgala, tell us that he fought for cattle. Quote, approaching the bull, meaning drinking Red Bull or Soma, they made him roar in the midst of battle. I, Mudgala, have thereby gained in war hundreds and thousands of cattle well pastured. Unquote. Such personal statements that the sages fought for cows redress any claims that they were only gifts to support Brahmins from Aryan chiefs' own herds alone and had no connection to violence. Females. Quote, the magnificent lord, the protector of the virtuous, Trasadasyu, the son of Purukatsa, has given me 500 brides. Unquote. It was earlier mentioned that females were also won in raids, which was the universal custom of the ancient world. Reference to these captures are found in several places in the Rig Veda. The sages say Lord Indra has given wives to those who were without women. In this same hymn, the commentator Sayana states that these were young women the Deva carried off from Susna. I should note here, to be honest and upfront, I am uncertain if this is a human being or an asura here. They may share a common name. Other items. The primary object of the raids was cattle. However, there are references to other objects won in combat. Seer Pajra mentions bags of gold, and in other places Lord Agni is said to give gold. There is also a passing reference to gold ornaments and gold vessels. Finally, there is a mention of 300,000 garments, given by Devasra and Purusanti. Once again, in this we see that the donation is made by specific individuals, meaning that it reflects an historic event and not a metaphor. Conclusion. If we apply Aurobindo's dictum that all cows are rays of light, then we have a large number of inscrutable passages. What does 77 or 60,000 rays of light actually mean? If the horse is the symbol of ego, individual will, or desire, how does one win 10 egos or 100 wills in a struggle with the dark side of oneself? What is a psychic gold earring, which was prized as spoil, for example? Also, the claim that there were only Aryans and that the Dasyus were simply sinful or bad behaving Aryans is not supported by the Vedas. In the Atharva Veda, the Turvasus and Yadus tribes were at one point labeled as defiant, yet they did not lose their Aryan identity and become identified as Dasyus. Undoubtedly, one could be creative and begin crafting numerological or layered symbolic meanings to these verses. But it would be clearly forced and would drive the speculation further and further from the context that is given in the hymns until all meaning is lost in the hazy corridors of airy castles. It is not only a waste of energy, but such speculations distort the actual esoteric threads of the Vedas. The seers here are not reporting mystical experiences, but actual events for which they were expressing gratitude to the Devas. It also makes clear then, and at least some of the general statements previously noted, where the sages speak of cattle raids, they are not obstructed by symbolist projections onto the text. Verses such as the following mean exactly what they say. Quote, "Men invoke you, such as you are, in the thick-thronged, wealth-bestowing conflict. May this your succor be granted in war, powerful Indra." So there were physical cows, and there were physical Dasyus, whomever they may have been. As a final note, the Vedas are not linear. They cannot be reduced to one meaning, as they used layered poetic imagery repeating with different inflections of meaning and highly subtle relationships between them to communicate various ideas and concepts. The best description that I have is that the Vedas should be thought of as a fractal. The Dasyus in the four Vedas. This study will now shift and begin an examination of the most common description the seers give regarding the Dasyus. In categorizing these verses, we will be able to construct a picture of who the Dasyus may have been in the Vedas. The infidels. The most common adjective used in the Vedas, by far, to describe the Dasyus is that they are some variation on the word unbelievers or infidels. They are false worshippers. Not only are they the enemies of the 5 tribes, but the god-insulting barbarians were foes of the Devas as well. The sages frequently pray to Lord Indra to destroy the heathens, for Lord Indra is the foe of the unbeliever. The objects of their cult were regarded by the seers as dangerous and false, and Lord Agni destroys believers in false gods. The level of animosity was such that the seers sought and sacrificed for the slaughter of those who did not worship the sacred fire and offered no libation. The starkest example of this is found in 2 mantras, where the sages call for Lord Indra and the Ashivns to behead the unbelievers. The lawless and inhumane cults. Within the Vedas, as is covered in much more detail in my study, question, who is the Supreme Lord in the Vedas? It was noted that although the seers had a wide variety of opinions regarding the identity of the Supreme Lord, unlike monotheistic cults with their metaphysical absolutism reaching to the minutiae of theological speculations, the sages never criticized each other for holding divergent religious views. Why should the cults of the Dasyus be treated any differently? Modern Hindus, for example, would most likely not denigrate a faith such as Santeria. Was it merely because the Dasyus were outside the Aryan community? Unlike the cults of the Devas, the seers tell us frequently that the Dasyus were lawless. This seems a rather general statement and could be read by some as typical of the prejudicial projections of one group which believes its own values to be inherently superior to others which may be different. The Islamic colonists in Europe, for example, say the natives are lawless since they do not adhere to the codes of Sharia law. Carefully examining the verses in the Rig Veda, it becomes clear that there was a specific practice which incited the ire of the sages. Quote, The Dasyus practicing no religious rite, not knowing as thoroughly, following other observances, obeying no human law, unquote. The scholars comment on the phrase following other observances that they acted in a way which is outside universal custom and ways which were akin to those of evil spirits. The hymns of the Vedas clarify the nature of this inhumanity, ritual cannibalism. There are prayers in the Rig Veda to protect from cannibals, which suggest that they engaged in raids on Aryan homesteads to seek victims. Quote, "Bestow upon us, Agni, the power which may overcome any cannibal entering into our abode, the wrath of any malignant being." Unquote. Pardon me. These prayers are also repeated elsewhere. The only other association with cannibalism implicitly is found regarding the practices of the sorcerers, the Yatudanas, in the Atharva Veda. There, the sages describe a practice of sorcerers who smear their body with flesh of men, and as part of their rites, wear bear skins and dance in the forest. While the Dasyus have greatly receded by the time of the Atharva Veda, it seems the dead crabs and rotten seaweed left by their retreating red tide was the covert cults of the sorcerers. The continuity of such a specific practice as cannibalism strongly suggests that it is justifiable to conclude there was a link. No call for holy war in the Vedas. It should be made clear at this point, the Vedas are not calling for a general, open-ended holy war which can randomly be applied to whomever may be the enemy of the day. This violence is reserved for those movements which pose a grave threat to society with their chaotic violence and engage in the most hideous and inhuman practices, such as cannibalism. They are not applicable to those with whom one may have a theological or political dispute alone. Black-skinned babblers. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the subject of the Dasyus is the question of ethnicity, or more specifically, their appearance. In the early history of the defunct Aryan invasion theory, the British envisioned armies of shining, blonde Wagnerian demigods like the Welsungs, with the fires of civilization and chariots crashing down upon the cowering black hordes who needed to be conquered, as there was no other way to elevate them from their brute savagery. It is, I'm sure, only a coincidence that this vision conforms to Kipling's famous white man's burden. It would be unheard of, I'm equally sure, for a proper and moral Victorian lord to use this as a justification for crass imperialism in the subcontinent. Lord Oakley, 1835, excuse me. While political correctness may have mollified the academic view, this is still a touchy topic. There are certainly legitimate etymological disputes regarding these translations and these phrases in Sanskrit. Also, even in its original conception of the fair-skinned Aryans, this is not supported by the texts themselves. The Vedic tribes of the Aryans were most likely tawny. This is found in a mantra where one of the sages prays for a tawny-hued sun. Pardon me. The internal textual evidence is then, at least from the only piece we have, that they very well may not have been fair-skinned, as Oldenberg thought. The viewers should bear in mind, just because someone can translate something doesn't mean that they either understand, pay attention, or are not victims of ideology in which their own mind in reading it censors out certain things. In the verses themselves, the sages tell us that Indra scatters the black host, and that blacks give up riches for fear of Agni. The presence of riches here implies this is a material and not a reference to the etheric species of the Rakshasas, who are also described as black. And this description is also used in the Vedas for another etheric species, the Asuras, who are red in the Puranas. In the Atharva Veda as well, the barbarians are described as black. I leave the etymological analysis of Krishna Tattvak to those who are better informed. The viewer should decide for himself, hopefully not based on something as transient and vapid as modern political considerations. This discussion can be found on a variety of places on the internet. However one may view this term, it is clearly not the defining aspect of the Dasyus for the seers of the Vedas. The proportion can be seen from the fact that the Dasyus are lawless unbelievers in roughly 20 plus mantras, but black in perhaps clearly and undisputably maybe 5. Such a minor reference is clearly not indicative of skin color prejudice. There may be good reason for this. In a number of mantras, as we have seen from the spoils of raids that the Aryan warriors took, among them were females. While there is no way to accurately estimate the number, it is certain that there was some ethnic blending occurring even at the period of the Rig Veda. Besides that, in this context, what does black mean? It is clearly not the degree of distinction between an Anglo-Saxon and an African Negro. If there was a distinction at all, it was probably not that great. An even more rare description of the Dasyus is found clearly in one mantra alone. This is the implication that they spoke a language other than Sanskrit. In this mantra, they are called babblers. Quote, "May Agni utterly confound those Dasyus who perform those sacred rites, who are babblers defective in speech," unquote. In a second verse, less certain into its meaning, they are called speech-bereft. Quote, "You, Lord Indra, have formally detached one wheel of the car of Surya. Another you have given to Kutsa, wherewith to acquire wealth. With the thunderbolt you have confounded the voiceless Dasyus. You have destroyed in battle the speech-bereft foe." Unquote. For the sake of argument, let's simply grant that these refer to the Dasyus as speaking another language, although in the second mantra I'm a little more uncertain, since it is commonly cited as such. It should be pointed out that there is even dispute about this reading, as some, such as Max Müller, have seen this as meaning without a nose, meaning flat negroid noses, although in modern times this is generally rejected. If this is a distinction in language, and this language was so alien to the five tribes, why is this not emphasized? In classical European civilization, among the Nahuatl speakers of Mesoamerica, and in historical Japan, mocking those who do not speak your language as inferior and barbaric, the origin of our English word, is the norm. This is a common cross-cultural trait. Given that the seers so anathematized the cults of the Dasyus, one would expect any such distinction to be more prominent. But it's not. Its absence, save for one and possibly two verses, implies to me that there was a high degree of linguistic familiarity. Was this due to frequent trade, or that the females captured in raids taught their children their native language as well? Perhaps the Dasyus spoke a clearly related language, and the situation was akin to that of early medieval northern England, where those who spoke Old English and Old Norse could communicate to a fairly good degree. Or, to be fair and consistent, one might argue that the Dasyus actually spoke Sanskrit. Personally, I think it is the first sentence that explains this absence. Cities of stone and iron. Another association with the Dasyus are cities and forts which are unassailable. These are described as iron forts and cities of iron, resistant to attack. I think one of the few points of universal agreement is that there was no actual metal iron in the era of the Rig Veda, and that these are only poetic statements. There were no such actual architectural structures of metal. Such cities are mentioned, quote, "He put to sleep by delusion with his destructive weapon 30,000 of the servile races for the sake of Divodas," unquote. The critic might point out that these structures are all associated with the etheric species, the Rakshasas and the Asuras, and that it takes a deva to destroy them, not men. These are the iron-walled cities of the Rakshasas, as well as the floating city of Susna, which is similar to Tripura and the much later Hiranyapura, which was of course the location of Arjuna's genocide of the Nivatakavacha tribe, both of which existed in the Asura realm and not the material realm, which I stress for ancient alien enthusiasts. To further support this contention, the critics would cite the verse where the destruction of such cities was done by Lord Indra and Lord Vishnu, not Aryan warriors. Quote, "Indra and Vishnu, you have demolished the 99 strong cities of Shambhara. You have slain at once without resistance the 100,000 heroes of the Asura Varchin," unquote. But this is clearly an event which occurred in the Asura realm and not the material realm, since Varchinasura is mentioned, and that an ancient army of 100,000 human warriors would be logistically very difficult and rare given the resources of ancient societies. The Dasyus and the Rakshasas. This leads to the next subject to briefly consider. This is the degree of overlay between the terms Dasyus and Rakshasa. This was covered in some depth in the video Villains of the Vedas Part 1, the Rakshasas, so I will only touch on it in passing here. Anyone who is interested in more fully exploring this and sourcing the arguments should refer to that video. In summary, especially as relates to the verses in which forts and cities are the subject, there are times in which the seers do refer to the etheric species, Rakshasas and Asuras, but it is clear that this is also a derogatory term that is used for the DASYUS, especially given their behavior as, well, like evil spirits. This is not uncommon in conflicts to demonize, hence the word, the opposing side. This does refer to historical events in the material realm as well. For example, the aforementioned verse I will repeat here. Quote, "He put to sleep by delusion with his destructive weapons 30,000 of the servile races for the sake of Divodas." Unquote. Here, the warrior Divodas was assisted by Lord Indra to sack a city of the servile races, a term for the DASYUS. It would seem that this was accomplished by stealth. The number of 30,000, even if exaggerated, would indicate this was a large city by the standards of the ancient world. Having reached the issue of large stone cities, this leads us to the Indus Valley civilization, and it also takes us to part 2 of this study. Part 2. Whatever was happening in the ancient subcontinent, only one thing is for sure. Nothing is for sure. For that reason, while I will offer an opinion about the DASYUS in this section, if I turned out to be wrong, I wouldn't take it too hard. That being said, probably the most important question is, were the DASYUS the Harappans? The Indus Valley civilization, or the Harappans. A brief review. Along with the Egyptian and Mesopotamian, the Harappan culture, or the Indus Valley civilization, is one of the oldest, on Earth. It flourished in the Bronze Age from 3,300 to 1700 BC, according to the professors. While the core was in the Indus Valley, its cultural zone extended through the northwest of the subcontinent. The reason for the term Harappans is because Harappa was the first recognized site to be excavated in the 1920s. The Harappans are credited with a number of advances and skilled techniques of metallurgy and handicrafts, working in stones such as carnelian and making unique seal carvings. Perhaps their greatest achievement was in the area of urban planning, with geometrically laid out cities of brick houses with draining systems and both water conservation and supply. In the semi-arid region of these parts of northern India, this was obviously very important. The language of the Harappans is unknown, as is their political organization. At the very least, much like the Greeks, they were city-states, united by a common culture. Identification of the Aryan tribes with the Harappans. There are those who claim that the Indus Valley civilization was Aryan. Their rationale is that, on the one hand, there is a material civilization without a culture, and on the other hand are the major cultural artifacts of the Vedas without a material civilization, they claim. In videos I have seen Dr. Frawley make this argument. This may come to be correct as knowledge of the Harappans grows, but there is no necessary link between the two phrases. In other words, one may be skilled at architecture and urban planning and not necessarily as a culture possess the resources to create the Vedas. Think of the Romans. Conversely, simple shepherds can attain the spiritual depth, maturity, and insight to create the Vedas in just mud hovels. If there were mantras in the Atharva Veda, for example, to expel yakshas from the stone temple grounds or the king's walled palaces, then that would support the claim to an Aryan identity to Mohenjo-Daro. As it stands, that does not seem to be the case. Identification of the DASYUS with the Harappans. It is not unreasonable to argue that the DASYUS were the Harappans. The strongest piece of evidence in support of this thesis is the association with stone buildings. While the Aryan tribes did have towns, the impression of the Rig Veda is that they lived primarily in rural homesteads. They are not said to have lived in stone structures in the text. The second piece of evidence is the discovery of the Harappan lingam. Assuming the simple reading of the verse, the seers condemn the worship of the lingam explicitly, and one might argue based upon this that there is a link between this cult and the DASYUS. Quote, "Going to the battle, marching with easy gait, desiring the spoils. He set himself to the acquisition of all wealth, invincible, destroying the phallus worshippers. He won by his prowess whatever wealth was concealed in the city with the 100 gates." Unquote. The commentators Sayana says that this refers to licentiousness and not the Shiva lingam. And we would certainly hope that would be the case. There are some who might argue that the DASYUS could not have been the Harappans because the DASYUS were, as we have seen, lawless and engaged in cannibalistic practices, and this is indicative of a primitive stage of human development. The Indus Valley civilization, however, possessed well-planned cities, sophisticated water management, and stone buildings. Therefore, they were too developed for such a primitive level of culture. However, this is not historically the case. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs had a similar technical level of development with the Harappans, sans the metal, but they engaged in ritual cannibalism, so this is not an argument. Critique of the identification of the DASYUS with the Harappans. Questions regarding stone cities and Harappan artifacts. When looking through all the verses for which the DASYUS are the subject, it is noticed that those which refer to a connection between them and stone cities are actually few. In fact, clearly the reference to Divodas is perhaps the only one. This does not seem to have been a primary association of the DASYUS. Nowhere do the sages tell us that the DASYUS built such cities either. Simply because they may have been there does not mean they were the Harappans. Perhaps the seers used the term DASYUS in a broad sense to cover a wide variety of people in the way that both Hebrew and Germanic tribes, despite great differences, were simply reducible to barbarians, to the Greeks, those arrogant Greeks. In reference to the stone city sacked by the hero Divodas, this may have been one which the Dasyus occupied as squatters and the Aryans ejected them, or it was a separate incident of conflict with the Harappans themselves, while the Dasyus, as primarily described, are not this people. There are a number of possibilities. A subject which is, though conspicuous by its absence, is the presence of specifically Harappan artifacts among the battle spoils of the Aryan warriors. Obviously, the tribes were primarily concerned with cattle and high-status items such as horses. However, the Harappans produced a variety of high-quality jars, pots, and certainly metal weapons, in addition to luxury items such as necklaces and statues. The sages do mention gold earrings and gold vessels with oils specifically, so they were interested in such items. Where are these artifacts? There should also have been another vector of influence from the Indus Valley civilization on the tribes if they were identical to the Dasyus outside of trade, the captured females. Having already seen reason to suspect that they may have taught their native language to the offspring, in addition to the paternal Sanskrit, this raises the question: why did they not incorporate other technical aspects of Harappan culture as well? A serious answer to both of these questions may be because they didn't have it, since they weren't Harappans. Speculation on the identity of the Dasyus. At this point, I wish to unveil a model which I think accounts for all of the data regarding the Dasyus in the Vedas and avoids the issues raised regarding their potential identification already mentioned. Pardon me. That was a dramatic pause. My thesis is as follows. The Dasyus were an unidentified, very probably mixed cohort of nomads operating in the border zones outside the Harappan city-states and the scattered towns and homesteads of the 5 Aryan tribes. A related way to view them might be as generally affiliated large bands of bandits. The term Dasyus. The sages use this term generically for all people who are not members of the 5 tribes. The Aryans cannot be Dasyus even if they behave badly, even if they hate the word, they don't sacrifice, don't follow the light, and all such negative attributes, since they mention Aryan enemies separately anyway. Thus, there were potentially Harappan Dasyus and nomadic Dasyus. The tribes may have had conflicts with the Harappan polities. For example, when Divodas sacked a stone city by stealth, but this does not seem to have been the norm. However, the sages would still classify them as Dasyus, since they worshipped the lingam, if that is what that artifact represents, and if Sayana is wrong. However, that verse would also imply that there was a Harappan city with 100 gates, and on that subject, I don't know. That needs more research. The nomadic Dasyus. If the nomadic Dasyus were connected with the Harappans at all, it was only incidentally. The reason for this is that while most of the conflicts of the 5 sacrificing tribes was with this group, they did not yield spoils which were specifically products of Harappan material culture. If anything, the absence of account of taking statues, fine metal weapons, tools, carnelian objects, and chariots, although there could be some discussion about the subjects of chariots, that probably needs to be drilled into more deeply, from the Dasyus would appear to imply that they were not only not the Harappans, but they were less technologically developed than the settled Aryans. This would be consistent if they were nomads who acquired their weapons primarily from the dead in battle or trade from raw materials, since they did not have any, or at least not very sufficient, numbers or skill levels of skilled smiths and resources to forge their own. The Vedas do not specifically say that the nomadic Dasyus were groups of mixed peoples. However, it should be noted that the sages do refer to them at times in the plural. They are the servile races, implying there is more than one race or ethnic group present. Why this might be or how this came to pass is an open question. Probably the answer, if this thesis is correct, will come from some future information that will be learned from the Indus Valley civilization. Were they simply large bands of highway bandits or renegades like Robin Hood? Although maybe Robin Hood isn't the best example, since Robin Hood was, of course, a native Saxon aristocrat by those invading Normans, so maybe I should edit that out. I don't want to give ammunition to anyone. Besides their cannibalistic rites, the seers may have seen the nomads as lawless, not only because of their theft of cattle and horses, but in general because of their rootless nomadic lifestyle. This is hardly respectable to farmers and craftsmen. A synonym for lawless is outlaw, which carries an inflection of meaning of violent criminal gangs. Although I must admit I may be projecting my own cultural baggage as an American from the 19th century settlement of the American West onto this term. Perhaps the Dasyus were something akin to Billy the Kid. By the time of the later Vedas, the nomadic Dasyus appear much less frequently in the text. If they were the Harappans, for example, whom the Aryans had at last conquered to acquire the bricks they used for the fire altars outlined in the Yajur Veda, but not mentioned in the Rig Veda, I will say in passing, they would have praised Lord Indra for their submission, or thanked Lord Varuna for granting them cities of stone. But this is not so. The Dasyus simply seem to fade away as a large presence. This can be explained if identified as groups of nomads. Being mixed cohorts, they lacked the cultural core of the Aryans and the Harappans to hold together over an extended period, especially if circumstances changed. Thus, the Dasyus were either assimilated or simply dispersed, much like the sea people at the end of the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean, since I mentioned something about that earlier. With that, I will end here. I hope this video will spur discussion and further research on this topic. There is certainly much more to say, and I will be interested to hear any reflections and opinions on my own thesis. Thank you very much.